Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how to reduce injury risk during weight training by appropriately managing training loads. First and foremost, we need to define exactly what training load is. Training load is simply how much total workload is performed over a specific period of time. This is not only relevant to resistance training, but it is also related to other sports and physical activities. However, training load needs to be defined specifically for each form of exercise. So in relation to resistance training, we can use volume as the metric to define training load. For the most part, this would mean using the number of sets performed per muscle group per week. However, for some specific forms of resistance training, other methods of calculating volume may be used. For specific powerlifting training, the volume load may be used for the competition lifts, meaning the sets times reps times load. Or in the case of Olympic weightlifting, the number of competition lifts above a certain load threshold may be used as a metric for volume. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what exact definition of volume you use to calculate training load, because the principles of load management will be the same. The first principle we need to understand is tissue capacity. Every tissue in the body ultimately has a limit to how much it can handle from both a chronic and acute standpoint. Pushing training loads further than this will result in pain or injury. Let's now discuss how training load relates to injury from both an acute and chronic perspective. Acute tissue capacity refers to how much load is able to be tolerated in a single bout. This refers to how much force the tissue can handle before it essentially breaks. For example, an athlete may sprint and tear their hamstrings because the acute load was too great for the hamstring muscle to tolerate. During resistance training, acute injuries aren't as common because training is much more controlled and predictable than field or court sports, and the forces on tissues aren't as high as athletic movements like running and jumping. However, acute injuries can still happen, although they are usually very minor. Chronic tissue capacity refers to how much workload the tissue can handle over a long duration of time. While tissues may be able to handle a certain workload for a short duration, the fatigue it causes can accumulate and lead to injury over time. This is more relevant to resistance training, as trainees are more likely to experience a gradual onset of pain in certain joints over time, rather than an acute injury occurring. So ultimately, there is a certain level of volume that each muscle group and its relevant joints can handle that can be tolerated over time. When this workload is breached, it usually presents as joint or connective tissue aches and pains in the joints that are affected. The next principle to understand is how changes in workload influence injury risk. Essentially, sudden increases in workload increase a trainee's risk of experiencing pain and injury. The acute to chronic workload ratio has been used in the literature as a way to quantify changes in workload. While this ratio may not be a perfect way to quantify changes in workload, it can be useful to help us understand changes in workload. This ratio essentially compares the workload performed in a given week with the average workload performed over the previous 28 days. So if the tissues are only adapted to a certain chronic workload, a sudden increase in acute workload will mean that the tissues are not prepared for the demands of training. So basically, if we want to increase training load, we want to avoid sudden changes and rather implement a very gradual increase in workload over a number of weeks. So what can we practically conclude from all this information? And how does this relate to resistance training? Well, first and foremost, there is a limit to how much volume we can perform during a resistance training program. If we perform too much volume, certain tissues will eventually develop pain over time. How much volume each trainee can tolerate for different muscle groups is highly individual, and trial and error is the only true way to establish your limitations. The second key point is to ensure changes in any training variables are gradual over time, rather than sudden. So if a trainee wants to increase volume for a certain muscle group, they should add 1 to 2 sets per week rather than increasing volume by a drastic amount. This principle also has implications for trainees who have taken time off training or have been injured and training volume has been low. If this is the case, the trainee's tissues are not adapted to the demands of high volume training. So to get back to their original training volumes, they should slowly ramp up the volume each week rather than going straight back to their usual training routine. Sudden changes in workload also has implications for intensity and exercise selection. For strength athletes, lifting heavy loads is a specific skill that requires specific adaptations. So if a trainee wants to incorporate heavy lifting into their program, but has only lifted in the 6 to 15 rep range for the past few months, then they should gradually shift their loading and rep ranges to the heavier side. This can be done over a few weeks to ensure that we aren't suddenly going from traditional hypertrophy training straight into attempting 1RMs. In terms of exercise selection, each exercise stresses the muscles and joints in slightly different ways, even if the general movement pattern is similar. This means that if we want to change an exercise in our program, we should gradually introduce this rather than suddenly replacing it and performing the same volume as before. For example, a trainee may substitute a lat pull down in their program for weighted chin-ups. The trainee should perform chin-ups with slightly lower volumes initially to allow the body to adapt to the new stress. So the trainee may gradually increase the volume of chin-ups over 1 to 2 weeks to minimize injury risk. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.